We're going to get into our lesson. We began the last section of Ezekiel last week, and the Millennial chapters is what I call them, for lack of a better term, and that's actually what they are. And here's a description. We kind of looked at this last week, but just to kind of refresh your mind, this is how we'll go. This section breaks itself up into the description of the temple, which begins in chapter 40, verse 5 through 42, verse 20. Then it talks about the return of the glory of God to the temple in chapter 43, verses 1 through 11. And also it mentions and talks about it in chapter 44, verses 1 through 9. And then the law of the temple. This will probably be an interesting section for us as we look at the sacrifices and the order that is going to take place in the worship of the temple. And then the topography of the land. What happens to the land? That's looked at in chapter 47 and in chapter 48. So as we go into this chapter, into this first section, Ezekiel goes into a good bit of detail. He's not the only prophet that talks about the future, obviously. Most every major and about all the minor prophets in some form mention or refer to events that are going to take place at the end. But he's the only one that really goes into such extensive description of the temple being indwelt by God, a new order of worship for the temple. And this is an interesting aspect, that there will be temple worship restored, but it's going to be a different type of worship. It's going to be a different type of order. And a new quality of material and spiritual life is talked about. A new city symbolizing the unity and oneness of Israel and God. And it's going to wrap up in chapter 48, verse 35, Yahweh Shammah. In other words, the Lord is there. That's the last statement about the city and the new lands and so forth of millennium. And then the 12 tribes, the prince, the priest. These are things that Ezekiel goes into some detail that other prophets hardly mention, if they mention it at all. So it's just an interesting aspect of the layout of the temple. So you'll see many pictures. When I looked and tried to find an adequate picture that might depict the Millennial Temple, we don't know because it hasn't been built. But this is roughly probably maybe one of the easier pictures of the temple that I found. And it talks about the gates, and it talks about the Holy of Holies, all the courts, the river that flows out of the city. And this is a little more detailed picture. So this is the floor plan. Now, if you can't read all that, it's okay. I can't hardly read it with my glasses on. But what this does, it goes back and it breaks down all of the items that you're looking at in this picture. So you have, priest chambers. That's the PC that you see. The outer court is the OC. You have chambers in the outer court. That's what those little C's are all around. The righteous, steps that enter in through the southern gate. You have the eastern gate. You have the northern gate. And there is no wall on the western gate. Just an interesting aspect of the layout of the temple. Any questions on this? I mean, there's a couple of questions that automatically come to mind. How big is this thing? And when is it built? Now, in thinking about the Millennial Temple, temple measurements are made in terms of the long cubit or royal cubit. This is talked about in chapter 40, verse 5. A regular cubit in the Old Testament was about from the tip of the middle finger to the tip of the elbow, or about 18 inches, depending on whose elbow, you were measuring. But that was more or less the standard. In chapter 45, we're told that the cubit was a cubit and a handbreadth, or about 21 inches. And this is what is called the royal measuring. So this makes the cubits, 6 cubits would make 10.5 feet. This equals 1 rod. Now here's where the difficulty or the question comes in. There's a lot of debate as to whether to consider the size of the temple in a cubit or rod. In chapter 42, verse 16, you'll see in most translations the term cubit, but that is inserted. The Hebrew word there is the word rod, which is the 10.5 feet. And the reason that commentators change on this is because if you think about the temple, it's 500 rods. It's square. So if you're thinking 500 rods at 10.5 feet per rod, you're talking a building that is a mile or more square. And if you're talking about the 18.5 inch cubit, and you don't use rod, you just use cubit, 500 cubits equals about 875 feet. So it would be a square 875 feet. So it's interesting because there's debate, and the debate just centers basically around the fact that do we want to consider a building that is a mile square? Jerusalem itself now, the layout of the land would hardly accommodate a mile square. The temple complex now is nowhere near something like that. Now, I don't have a problem with seeing it as 1 mile square, because when Jesus comes back and splits the Mount of Olives, there's going to be major topographical changes that take place. So it could very well easily be that it could be a mile square. The topography of it would be able to accommodate a building that's 1 mile square. Some pictures that you will see of the temple is that the temple is sitting upon a mountain, because it talks about the mountain of the Lord. Now, oftentimes in the Bible, the word mountain refers to kingdoms. And that's how it's most often looked at. But there are some teachers that will talk about, and you'll see a picture of the Millennial temple, and the Holy of Holies is up on top of the mountain. And everything goes down from the mountain. That could be, I don't know. This makes the most sense to me, but you look at what I'm thinking out of, so, my head, so. But that's how big. Questions on that, things or comments that you've heard regarding the temple layout and so forth? Now, when is it built? We're not told. Obviously, it should be in the early days or years of the millennium. So, a 1 mile square building, a complex, not just building, but complex, will take a while, even though the walls surrounding it, as you read in Ezekiel, and I'm not going to go through and read all these, it's really boring to just read it out loud to you. The wall, the outer wall, is only about 6 or 8 feet high, depending on the measurement that you use. So the wall surrounding the temple complex is not meant to just shut people out. You can easily see the temple, you can easily be there, and we'll talk about some of this because there's some unique characteristics of this temple.
What do you mean before you go on? It says a rod 500 square, 875. Are you squaring the 500 or are you squaring the 875? I don't understand.
Now, the temple is The temple complex is a square. So there's 500 either cubits or rods in measurement. The temple on this side's 500, 500, 500, 500. So the 875 comes in, if you just look at the cubit measurement, then you have roughly 875 feet square around. But if you use the rod measurement, which is 10.5 feet.
It's 52 feet.
Huh?
52 feet.
Yeah, you got right at a mile.
Each way?
Each way, all the way around. That is a huge, yeah, that's a huge complex, to think about. And it's got a river. It's got a river that comes from under the threshold of the temple. Yeah, I mean, to me it makes sense. Because as you read Ezekiel and you look at the river, as it begins to flow out, Ezekiel is told to go out into the waters. And he goes about 1,000, 1,500 feet out. And it's just to the ankles or to the knees, and then it's up, and then it keeps going. So the river that comes out of the temple is not a gushing river to begin with. It increases. And this would have to be by a miracle of God, because there are no feeder streams that we know of that will feed into it. None are mentioned anyway. That would take a lot of topographical change. And we'll look at that river in just a little bit. But this is some of the things, as you read these final chapters, it kind of comes to your mind just like, okay, how big is this? And why is it this big? Why would you need a mile square, if that's what it is, complex?
Well, if you go to the Millennial reign, it talks about all nations will go to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
All nations will celebrate the feast.
Yeah.
So it has to be, if you're going to fit people in there,
Yeah.
it's going to have to be pretty big.
Yeah.
Also, because it says that those that don't celebrate the festival of tents or festival of booths, they will have no rain.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Yeah.
designed.
Zechariah 14, yeah.
I'd say, the way I read it, it's gonna be the mile size, just
Yeah.
to try to accommodate the people that are going to be coming there.
Yeah. You've got a world worship. And indeed, to accommodate the special feast and so forth, people that will be coming, 875 square feet, feet square, it's not too large of a building to deal with that number of people. It makes more sense to me, just like as David said, 1 mile. Because you have a world worship that will be taking place. People from all over the world will be coming to worship, in this new Jerusalem. But good question.
So you think the Ark of the Covenant is going in?
No, that's an interesting thing about that. Unique features of the temple, and you see this in chapter 40 through 42. There's no wall of partition to exclude the Gentiles. It will be open. Compared to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14, where Paul says that, the wall, the boundary has been broken down. The Gentiles were previously welcomed in the outer courts, but excluded from the inner courts on pain of death. Zechariah chapter 8, verses 22, 23. That's going to be gone. There's no court of women. Women were separated from the men. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. And there's no court of women. There's no laver where they would wash. Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 24 through 27. Titus chapter 3, verse 5 and 6 talks about us being washed by the Spirit and the Word. There is no physical labor for the priest in the temple, in this temple, to wash. The washing comes from the reality of salvation in them. There's no table of showbread in this temple. There's no lampstand or menorah in this temple. So, as you look at these things, the temple is going to be radically different from anything that Israel has ever seen. There's no golden altar of incense. There's no veil. There's no Ark of the Covenant. The only major change that's going to continue is the altar. There will be stairs going to the burnt offering altar. Exodus chapter 20, verse 23, the Lord told Moses that you use stones. You never build stairs. Although Solomon's temple had stairs to it. But there will be no, this altar will be huge. It's going to be a huge piece of furniture. Of course, you got a temple that's a mile. you don't put a stool in a temple that big. You've got something very large. But these are some of the unique features. So, go back just a moment. I may have went through these a little quick. No wall of partition to exclude Gentiles. No court of women. No laver. No table of showbread. Why? Because Jesus is the bread of life. No lampstand or menorah. Why? Because Jesus is the light of the world. You don't need a lamp representing or being a copy or a shadow, because you're going to have the actual fulfillment of that in the temple, in the glory of God. And then no golden altar of incense. Prayer will go directly to the Lord. No veil. No Ark of the Covenant. Chapter 43 talks about the return of the glory of the Lord. If you look in that chapter, and the things that I'm skipping in these chapters really is a lot of the detail, which to look at and talk about is just a little time consuming and boring for you. You can do that because there's nothing that really stands out interesting. Yep.
You said that the prayer will be directed to the Lord. We're already there.
Yes.
The veil's already torn.
Yes. And we have to remember this is for the Jews. Primarily, the temple was a Jewish temple. Now, Gentiles will be involved. Salvation is there, but the layout was laid out for a Jewish population in Ezekiel's time. So the impact of that would be powerful to them, more powerful to them than it is to us in the New Testament. We know that prayer goes directly to the Lord.
Did you say about the altar?
The altar, yes. Let me see here. Yeah. The altar of sacrifice, chapter 43, verses 13 through 17. This is one of the pictures that you will see. It seems to be the most simple of the ones that I looked at. It's called the table in chapter 44, verse 16. And in the place of the offering of the special, the sacrificial gifts to God. It's also called the, I'm sorry?
Maybe this is a dumb question, but why do you have that?
Yeah, good question. No, it's not a dumb question at
We
all.
don't have to sacrifice anymore.
No.
Why is that there?
So why would it be there? Why do you think?
Well, I don't picture it as, I picture it going up in like this big place, and then that's where, if Jesus comes back, you would see Jesus. I can't even, I guess because they're Jewish, maybe they still have it, but like me, I don't even know how you got off.
Because I would put Jesus right there as far as at least something, because he did the ultimate sacrifice. I'm not talking about him himself, but that to say Jesus sacrificed for all of us, that's why we have a temple.
Yeah, the
So why would you go there? Why would you go to the altar and
okay. Why would you have a temple?
why would you go to the altar?
And it all ties in together. The big question is, why do you have a temple? If we are the temple of God, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, chapter 6, why would you need a mile square temple complex? to begin with.
You're gonna have the millennial reign, there will people be born in the millennial reign, and there will be under theocracy, and they're going to, they need to know, they need to be educated.
They need to know, they need,
Automatically born with
yeah.
the Holy Spirit.
they need to be educated. Huh?
It's the most holy place.
Yeah, and they need to be educated because the temple is a visible throne of the house of God. We're told that in chapter 43, verse 7. It's the visible sign of God choosing Israel, remember? All the way back, Abraham. I will bless you and make you the father of many nations. You will not be able to count. If you can count the stars, you'll be able to count the number of descendants that you would have. It is the visible sign of God choosing Israel. Even in the millennium, Israel is still going to be pointed out as the chosen nation. There will be other nations. I don't know what they'll be called, but I know what one of them will be called: Israel. And it will be the supreme nation. Even itty-bitty Israel is going to be the supreme nation. It's a visible sign of the holiness of God. This is something that visibly shows to the world that comes to Jerusalem and comes to these feasts. This is a visible sign of the holiness of God. Verse 7 and chapter 44, verses 5 through 9.
And the temple has to be built then because it's been destroyed.
Yeah,
So it's not there. So if we believe what the Bible says, it has to be built.
yeah. There will be a tribulation temple, if you will, that's going to be built.
A tribulation temple.
Yeah. And the covenant that Antichrist makes with the Jews for that last week of years, Revelation chapter 11 talks about the temple. And he says, measure it. Now, we don't know the dimensions of it, but there is going to be a temple, Jewish temple, rebuilt. Now, right now, the Muslims have a little problem with that. So, whether what Antichrist wants to do before he makes the covenant and he establishes the temple, or after he makes the covenant and builds the temple. But there's going to be a war in there somewhere. It could be Gog and Magog. I think it probably is. Or it could be that, if you want to separate them, the war that happens in Revelation chapter 9, where you have 200 million show up. And I think they're robotics. But nonetheless, they're all destroyed. We never know of a nation that's involved with that, or what happens after they lose. You know, it's never stated in Revelation. I assume, and it makes most sense to me, which, once again, but it makes most sense to me to see what happens in Revelation 9 as the battle of Gog and Magog. And now, so that temple, that at the end of the tribulation, when Antichrist attacks Jerusalem, Zechariah chapter 13, it talks about the city falling. It talks about devastation happening. I believe that the tribulation temple is probably mostly destroyed in that conflict, Battle of Armageddon, which ends up in the Battle of Armageddon. Out of that begins the millennium, and now there is going to be a new temple, which will be, I guess if you want to call it, it'll be the fifth temple, because you have Solomon's, then you have Ezra and Nehemiah, then you have Herod's temple, you have the tribulation temple, and then you have the millennial temple. And I don't count them. It doesn't really make any difference to me. There's no value in the numbers. But I think the tribulation temple will be destroyed. And Israel will need a temple. God will need to show his choosing of Israel. And the temple has been the place that demonstrated God's choosing of Israel.
I have a question about God's choosing of Israel.
Uh-huh.
In light of that, Christ died for all of us. We are his children. And he loves all of us the same. God's choosing of Israel there, that sign, what is that supposed to
That is his nation.
represent?
It is his chosen nation, historically, his chosen people. And the temple will be a visible sign that what God promised to Abraham at this point, how many thousands of years ago, is fulfilled.
So it represents the fulfillment of this promise?
Yeah, of God's choosing of Israel as his people, as his nation. Even though there's, New Testament believers, we're all saved. The ground is level. But as far as a nation, Israel is the only nation that God has ever chosen. And this is going to be a visible sign of that special relationship, if you will, from a national standpoint.
Will the Jews recognize that?
They will in the millennium, because the Jewish revival begins midterm of the tribulation period with the death of the two witnesses, their resurrection and ascension in heaven. I think that really blows up, if you will, the Jewish revival. Now you have the two witnesses, you have the 144,000 that have been teaching and preaching for 3.5 years, but it's probably more, someone believes, many don't. They worship Antichrist until these two men who've been preaching about Jesus are resurrected and taken in heaven. All of a sudden, the nation says, we might need to rethink that, And the revival blows up, if you will. Good term in my mind. The nation returns to God. And Antichrist, in seeing that, violates his covenant and determines to kill them and destroy them, ultimately leading to the battle of Armageddon. Zechariah chapter 13 and 14.
So basically, if you get a visual around it, give or take, it's very doable because you're probably talking square footage of a building like the Pentagon. That's the closest thing in the United States we kind of have. And so it's there, and I understand that. And so like, what they were saying is, so if I'm Jewish in Israel, or in anywhere, and this is the Old Testament, so they believe this. They believe this because it's all.
Mm-hmm.
So, how if you're Jewish and you're God's chosen people and you believe this is going to happen, how do you how do they not believe
In Jesus.
Yeah, because if you believe this is going to happen, and they do,
Yeah.
really do.
Yeah.
So how do you stop that? Where's
Because
stopping?
in chapter 43, when it talks about the glory of the Lord returning, you remember back in chapter 9 through 11, I think it is, you had the glory of God departing from the temple. And when this says the glory of the Lord is returning, in their mind, it is the kabod, glory of the Lord, the heavy worship, worthiness of God. That is what departed, and that's what's coming back. We as New Testament believers know that glory, when he comes back, is Jesus. That's who that is. They don't, they don't see that right here. We see it from the New Testament looking back. Right here, they're saying the glory of God is going to return. And that's what they're looking for, the glory of God to return. They've yet to understand that the glory of God is Jesus. As Jesus told Thomas, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. The Jews don't get that. They have, as Paul said, Romans 9 through 11, there is a partial blindness that is over that nation right now, that is not going to be lifted until that revival breaks out during the tribulation period. With the 144,000 preachers and the two witnesses, all that together, you have this big Jewish return to and recognition that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the glory of God. So they will understand then that the glory of God returning is in the person of Jesus, But in reading it here, they see glory of God. They don't have a person, because the Old Testament says if you can't see God and live. So they think glory of God is what we have often called Shekinah glory, which that word is not in the Bible anywhere. But it's the kabod glory. It is the heavy, weighty, worthy worship of God that is going to return back. And in their minds, in reading this in the Old Testament, that's what left, that's what's coming back. We look at it from the New Testament side. What this is Jesus coming back. You know,
Do the Jews then, they believe that they are in the Old Testament, but they not come to a place to where they see the New Testament the way we do as Christians?
not in the writing of the book of Ezekiel. No, that's not, even today, they don't see it. They don't, we have Messianic Jews, but the Jewish people as a nation, as a people, they still reject Jesus. They're persecuting Christians in Bethlehem this year. The Jews are doing this. So they still don't see this. And they're reading, the Old Testament. They're understanding the Old Testament. And they just know that the glory of God is going to return. In the New Testament, we realize that this glory of God is Jesus Christ. He's the one who comes down and wins the battle of Armageddon. He is the glory of God that's going to return into the temple. Good questions, because as you read this section of Scripture, you kind of wonder why. Once again, sign of God's redemptive love. The temple is a sign of God's redemptive love. And it's the visible sign of a new relationship. And all these you see, 36, 21 through 19, and verses 9 through 11 of chapter 43. You have this. Excuse me, I kind of lost my balance.
So what did you say would be at the altar? I forgot what they answered that question.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered about 5,000 years at least here. We will have the altar. Now, and this goes right along with the altar, the burnt offering altar. There is no altar of incense. There is no golden altar, Ark of the Covenant. There is not. You have the reality. You have the presence of God. Now, why are there sacrifices in the millennium? And we have to remember in this, and we've talked about this already, this shows the Hebrew perspective of millennial worship. This is what it shows. Now, why didn't Ezekiel talk about a new group of Gentiles and people together? The only allusion he makes is that there's no court of the Gentiles. There's no wall separating. But this is a temple from the Hebrew perspective. Ezekiel had been shown the departure of the glory of God from Solomon's temple. He had been told of Jerusalem's destruction and the scattering of Israel. Then he'd been told of God's keeping and the restoration of all that he had covenanted with Israel. That began in chapter 34. And Ezekiel is told about the reinstitution of the sacrificial system.
What does that mean?
Reinstitution of the sacrificial system. There will be sacrifices offered during the millennium. Like animals being killed, yes.
Why?
And we're going to get to that too, You haven't got ahead of me. I anticipated these things. Yeah. Have you read Ezekiel before? I'm not making this up, it's right there. Ezekiel is told about the reinstitution of the sacrificial system. It's very close to the old Mosaic system, except there's not a Day of Atonement. Why? The Day of Atonement took place on Calvary. the fulfillment of that. You don't need another Day of Atonement. The Ark of the Covenant is not there. The Feast of Weeks is not there. A high priest is not there.
But then why do you need an animal sacrifice?
The temple, and here it is right here. Why you have sacrifices, why you have all, the temple and all that is involved. Hear that, all that is involved are object lessons and reminders of all that is the history of Israel, the larger sin of mankind, and the work of God in bringing lost mankind back to Him, who, remember, is holy. Hebrews chapter 7 through 10. There will be people born through that 1,000 years. They're raised in a whole new world compared to what we are living in now. They need an object lesson that will help them understand what we as Christians in the millennium are talking to them about. The temple and the sacrifices are that object lesson. Now, is all this going to change in the eternal ages? I am sure it is.
So they'll have to see and believe.
Not see to believe, but it will be object lessons that will help them understand. And in seeing that, they should believe. But this is more about the object lesson of all that has happened to bring us to this point in the history of the world. I'm sorry?
Jesus is going to be sitting there, right?
Yeah, he's going to be there. You know, that's why there's no Ark of the Covenant. He's the glory of God that returns. So why is he there? What is Jesus' presence all about? The sacrificial system is the object lesson that helps explain to the people who grow up in that time. Huh? That Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. This is an object lesson of what Jesus has actually accomplished before God.
I guess what's confusing is, this is okay. I mean, of course it's okay, because this is what God.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah, I'm glad you okayed the inspired word of God. I'm glad you did that.
But that's when God told Ezekiel this, and this is okay. I guess what is so strange is, with me and probably us, when you mention that staircase, I see Jesus there. So what's confusing me is why you have to go back and do all these old things. If you see Jesus sitting up there, is that not enough?
But Jesus is not going to be at the top of that altar. Jesus is in the Holy of Holies. He's in the place of the... Why is Jesus there? What is it about Jesus being there? It is the sacrifice that he made some thousands of years ago. We don't know how many, but some thousands of years ago by this time. And this will help explain to the world then why Jesus is in the Holy of Holies. What is this all about, Jesus in the Holy of Holies? There will be preaching of the gospel and all of this that goes on, but this will be the visible symbol of all that has happened. The object, the ultimate object lesson, if you will.
But Jews have to have sacrifice. I mean, that's just their culture. This fits in with Jewish people.
Yeah, and it's from a Jewish perspective here.
And that's one more quick question, that even in the Holy of Holies, since it's torn, it's not like a room that's in front where they can't see him.
No.
They will be able to see him. I guess that's what's mind-blowing. Even if I was born that day, I cannot imagine seeing Jesus and not knowing. But I think you're right, because it's me. Now, Lord, I know, that's what it's just so odd.
Yeah.
But I just, that they'll see him, but it's like they're younger. They won't know. So then they'll have to go back.
You've had teenagers, right?
All this stuff.
You can spell correctly.
I guess that's it.
It's interesting. It really is. And we're going to have to pick up next week because they've rung the bell and the kids are outside, have got tired of waiting on us and all that. But we'll pick this up